What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and the day is finally here. It is Thursday, April 14th, and the April 2022 Balance Data Slate has arrived at long last. Our prayers have been answered, and the 40k gods have decreed that the game will be perfectly balanced once again, with absolutely no exploits. As we've talked about in previous videos, the balance of Warhammer 40k has been in a pretty sad state for the last couple of months, and this balanced data slate is long past overdue, but we have received it now. And so let's go over everything in this data slate and talk about some of the most transformative changes to Warhammer 40,000. Now, one thing that I do appreciate about this data slate release as well is that the design team has essentially put a set of patch notes into this balanced data slate article that you can find on Warhammer Community. I'll put a link to this article in the description down below so you can check it out yourself. It covers their thoughts about the changes and their notes about everything that changed, which makes for some easier reading than going through the data slate itself. But that is what we're going to be doing anyway. So let's dive into this Q2 2022 data sheet and talk about all the changes made to Warhammer 40,000 because, oh boy, are there some doozies. Now, before we get too far into it, some of the things that I do want to address about this data slate are that it importantly follows the data slate paradigm of not only debuffing the most powerful and abusive factions in the game, but also bringing up the least played and least powerful factions. And I think this data slate does a pretty good job at doing that, throwing some pretty hefty bones to factions like Deathguard, Space Marines, Adeptus Sororitas, and Astra Militarum, while at the same time hitting powerful factions like Tau, Adeptus Custodes, and Eldari. It also should be noted that, speaking of Eldari, we should take into account the Eldari errata that I talked about yesterday that changed fundamentally some of the most powerful abilities in the Eldari Codex, specifically the Craft World side. We saw changes like Behareth only being able to teleport himself once per turn, and a change to Strains of Fate dice, forcing them to be rerolled if you reroll a multi-D6 roll that included a dice manipulated by Strands of Fate. Those are pretty big changes and pretty big nerfs to the Craft World side of the army. This balanced data sheet not only includes some core rules changes that will impact Eldari that we'll talk about, but also has some balance changes to the Harlequin side as well. So while there isn't an inclusion for Craft Worlds in this balanced data slate, we do holistically see the entire Eldari Codex get brought down a peg, which is very good because it's been dominant ever since its release. So let's start with our first new ability here. This is Armor of Contempt, an attempt to rebalance some of the power armor factions of the game, those being Space Marines, Grey Knights, all of the Chaos Space Marine factions, as well as Adeptus Sororitas. Especially standard Space Marines and Adeptus Sororitas, with a shout out to Deathguard as well, have been some of the most poorly performing armies in the game for a while, and this change tries to address that. It gives them the ability to reduce incoming AP values by 1. Full stop. There's no qualifier on that. It's not reduce AP 1 or 2 by 1 like some of the sub-faction abilities are. It affects any armor penetration value targeting those models. Given that power armor factions make up the vast majority of the game, this change is monumental and kind of speaks to the fundamental problem with the power creep of 9th edition 40k, where the AP values of the game have been pushing so far forward that now we need to include an almost universal rule to reduce all of those AP values. It's a little silly, but it does do the job of making these factions a lot more powerful to play. Now, there are a couple caveats here of units that this doesn't apply to. Specifically, it doesn't apply to models with a Storm Shield, Relic Shield, or Combat Shield, so those abilities that are going to increase your armor save and give you an invulnerable save will not get the benefit of the AP reduction. You still have that +1 save, which is better than AP reduction, so you should be fine either way. In addition, the Sacrosanct Shield and Force Shield ability also stops you from getting the benefit of this armor penetration reduction. That is specifically Sacrosancts and Nemesis Dread Knights, and any other rule that worsens the AP value of an attack does not stack with this ability. Now, with that in mind, we can talk about some specific changes to Adeptus Astartes and Adepta Sororitas. We see that sub-faction abilities, specifically Valorous Heart and Salamanders in the Space Marine Codex that we can see lower on in the page, have had their AP reduction clause in their subfaction ability replaced to each time an attack is made against a model with this tactic, the attack's wound roll cannot be rerolled. That means Salamanders and Valorous Heart both have lost their AP reduction ability. In Salamander's case, they could ignore AP values of 1, and in Valorous Heart's case, they would reduce AP 1 or 2 by 1. Those would have some pretty insane effects if you stacked them alongside the universal AP reduction. So instead, what they're going to do is prevent rerolls against those units. I think that this makes Salamanders a faction that I have ragged on for a long time as being sort of memey and very bad, as being a lot more difficult to take down, especially when you include lots of instances of 1 CP transhuman, especially if you include transhuman and stalwart effects. Preventing wound rerolls against those units becomes very, very difficult. A little bit less important against Adeptus Sororitas, but it's important to keep in mind that all of these effects, both the AP reduction and these anti-wound roll effects, do also affect their vehicles. So we're not just talking about the toughness 3 infantry. Things like exorcists and immolators are also going to be affected by these abilities, which makes them holistically across the entirety of the faction much more difficult to take down. Adeptus Sororitas have also gotten a buff to Miracle Dice. They now automatically gain 1 Miracle Dice at the start of each turn. This is in addition to the Miracle Dice that they would be gaining normally through any of their relics or from killing enemy units, meaning that the Miracle Dice economy of Adeptus Sororitas is going to be a lot smoother. This change is a super duper duper big deal, one that the impact of which is going to be difficult to suss out until you get some games on the table. Generally speaking, AP4 weapons have been universally very good at killing these power armor factions and force those factions to move to invulnerable saves to keep their models alive. Now an AP4 weapon, one of the highest AP values in the game and one that's very difficult to source, and especially beating AP4 is very difficult because there are very few weapons that hit that threshold of AP5. But AP5 is what you're going to need to actually punch through a power armor save now. Those AP4 weapons are still going to leave those power armor units on a 6-up save, which means a lot of very powerful and low volume attacks are not going to be quite as effective at knocking out entire power armor units. Speaking specifically as a Tyranid player, we have a lot of low volume AP4 melee weapons, things like monstrous bone swords, or in the previous version of the Codex, monstrous scything talons, upgraded with murderous size, and those would very cleanly cut through power armor, generally only being 5 attacks, but with full rerolls that can now be turned off by some of these subfaction abilities. Being AP4 now reduced to AP3 leaves them on a 6-up save. If I'm forcing 5 wounds through, there's a pretty good chance they roll one of those 6-ups, and suddenly that unit is not dying. Given that a lot of times those units are objective secured or in an aura, providing them objective secured, they'll be stealing objectives away from you, making your ability to score against that army that much more difficult. It also should be noted that while this can't stack with effects that reduce the armor penetration characteristic of an attack, they do stack with effects that increase your own armor save. Obviously not Storm Shields or Relic Shields, things like that, but abilities like Thousand Suns All Is Dust, which improves the armor save of their rubric units by 1 against 1 damage attacks, will still stack with this, meaning that even if you're attacking a rubric unit with an AP1 or AP2 weapon, if they're in cover, they can potentially even be saving against AP2 attacks on 2s, which is absolutely crazy to consider. Now, there are some legacy changes that are included in here. We see the aircraft rule maintained, where the number of aircraft you can include in an army is capped up to 2 for a strike force sized game, 1 for combat patrol or incursion, 3 for onslaught or greater. And there are going to be some of these existing changes that we will just gloss over in this review. The next super important change is this one to a new weapon keyword called indirect fire weapons. This is one that the community has been asking for a very long time. Indirect fire is a piece of nomenclature that the community used to reference weapons that ignored line of sight, essentially weapons that said that they could target units not visible to the bearer. And everyone wished for this to become a weapon keyword like blast, and now it effectively is. This rule defines what an indirect fire weapon is, that is, a weapon that can target units not visible to the bearer, and imposes a penalty on them if they fire at units that they do not have line of sight to. If an indirect fire weapon targets a unit that no models in the attacking unit has line of sight to, you reduce the ballistic skill characteristic of the attacking unit by 1, and give +1 to armor saving throws made against the attack. This, again, will stack with that AP reduction that a lot of factions are getting, meaning that it's going to be much more difficult for those factions to be punished by these indirect fire weapons. It's also important to note that this is a ballistic skill characteristic modifier, not a hit roll penalty. So instead of saying that attack reduces its hit roll by 1 or suffers -1 to hit, those would not stack with other -1 to hit effects, things like dense cover. Because this is a ballistic skill characteristic modifier, it will stack with those, meaning that if you are being fired at by an indirect fire weapon while touching dense cover, that attack is going to be effectively -2 to hit you. In addition, you're also going to be getting +1 to your saving throw, an additional +1 if you are benefiting from light cover as well. So you can see that in this way, indirect fire weapons are going to be much less effective when shooting out of line of sight. That said, they can still typically target things within line of sight, not suffer any of these penalties, and use that ability only when they absolutely need to. But again, that makes them operate much more like direct fire weapons. This is going to be one of the changes, like we mentioned earlier, that's going to especially impact factions like Eldari and Tau Empire. Eldari especially are predicated on the hefty use of artillery. Units like D-Cannons, Night Spinners, and Shadow Weavers are all mainstays of the Eldar army, and in conjunction with units using Fire and Fade or units like Swooping Hawks and Behareth that can redeploy after firing their weapon, Eldari try to do as much damage as they can without interacting with you. Now, they're going to be doing significantly less damage. Those weapons are going to be that much less effective. Now, that said, there are ways to get around that. Units like D-Cannons can source bonuses to hit and rerolls to hit off of Ranger units, but that does mean that the Eldari player is going to have to play a lot more aggressively with their support units, and it requires them to assemble combos of effects in order to get the maximum damage out of their indirect fire weapons, which, in my opinion, is a very good thing. That encourages some interactive play and forces the Eldar player to jump through some hoops in order to get the most effectiveness out of units like D-Cannons, and I think that's just fine. We also see a note here that Astra Militarum units do not suffer the penalties to hit or the bonuses to armor saving throws for the targeted by indirect fire weapons. That is a big deal because Astra Militarum not only have some pretty inaccurate indirect fire weapons, being majority ballistic skill 4, but also the army is essentially predicated on use of their indirect fire weapons, and it just makes sense that they would be the best ones at using them out of all of the factions. It gives the faction a little bit more of a unique flavor within the ecosystem of 40k. Now, next up, we're going to be talking about bodyguard abilities. Now, bodyguard abilities are specified as being abilities that prevent enemy character models from being targeted by a ranged attack. Now, these abilities are seen on things like Company Veterans, Custodian Wardens, and Celestian Sacrosancts, and all of those abilities have been changed wholesale to the character unit being affected can use the Lookoutser rule even if this unit contains fewer than 3 models. Now, obviously, this changes one of the most abusive interactions that has been introduced to 9th edition 40k. That is, playing very aggressively with your characters, but keeping a bodyguard unit out of line of sight within 3 inches, potentially 6 inches of them, if you have an aura ability increasing effect, and allowing those character units to essentially hold objectives and interact with the enemy while remaining almost entirely out of danger. You can still charge those units, cast psychic powers on them, but you can't shoot them with ranged attacks, even if they're the closest target, and potentially the only visible target to the enemy attacker. Now, this means that this bodyguard role is still going to be valuable, getting an additional bulwark of Lookoutser applied to those characters so that your opponent can't shoot you down below 3 models, but isn't going to be quite as uninteractive as it was before. Now, we see some clarifications here on exactly what abilities in the game are affected by this bodyguard rule. Interestingly, we have Guardian Organism from the Tyrannid Codex, and this affects the 9th Ed Tyrannid Codex as well. So this might be one of the first instances of a nerf to a codex being applied before the codex is even released. I've talked about a lot in the past in my Tyrannid videos about how the new Tyrant Guard are going to make Hive Tyrants entirely uninteractable by your opponent by providing this bodyguard ability. Now, instead, they have this ability here, where a Hive Tyrant that's within range of a Hive Guard's Guardian Organism gains all of the benefits of Lookoutser regardless of their wounds characteristic. I believe that this still maintains the interaction where a Hive Tyrant can itself Lookoutser for other characters while being Lookoutser'd. This doesn't say that for the purposes of Lookoutser, they're treated as having a wounds characteristic of 9. It only specifies that they gain the benefits regardless of their wounds characteristic. While this is going to change pretty significantly how the Tyrannid Codex plays, with those Hive Tyrants having to play a little bit farther back And it gives a little bit more credence to a battleship or a support Hive Tyrant, because those are going to be placed much farther back in your army than a more offensive melee winged Hive Tyrant. But given the general resilience of the Tyranid Codex and the aggressiveness of some of its units, I don't think it's actually going to impact how the Codex plays all that much. In some instances, it will just require you to expose your Tyrant Guard or other bodyguards in those cases out in front of the characters and force your opponent to kill them first before attacking the character themselves. If the character is relatively difficult to kill, that still means that your opponent's probably not going to be able to shoot them to death, and you'll be able to operate normally in the next turn. You just have to play more aggressively with those bodyguard units. That's because the bodyguard would then be providing lookouts to the character behind them and be closer to them, to your opponent, than the character themselves, and that unit would fulfill all of the requirements to prevent the character from being targeted. I think that's the purpose of the ability, and I think that's absolutely great. Forcing people to move their bodyguards potentially out of cover or play more aggressively with the other elements in their army in order to benefit from the bodyguard ability is exactly how things should be. So with that, let's move on to some of the specific faction changes. Now, we already talked about the changes to Space Marines and Adeptus Sororitas, but now let's talk about Astra Militarum, one of the most maligned armies in the game currently, with an absolutely abysmal win rate. However, the design team looking to change that, or at least prop them up a little bit with the inclusion of a brand new rule. This is Hammer of the Emperor. This adds a special detachment ability to all of your Astra Militarum detachments, and provides all of your regiment units, provided that you are drawn entirely from the same regiment, which, if you are playing a GT 2022 game, you have to be, unless you are mixing in locked regiment keyword units like special characters or Death Corps of Krieg units. If you fulfill all of those requirements, then you get a Gene-Rot Might effect on all of your ranged attack rolls. This means unmodified hit rolls of 6 automatically wound their target. This means that mass lasgun fire, mass mortar fire, like we've just been talking about previously, which isn't affected by the new indirect fire rules, is going to be able to put dents into even heavily armored targets with high toughness values. And since approximately 1 out of 6 of your attacks is going to be automatically wounding, that's absolutely crazy. This also affects your lower volume, higher impact attacks. Things like demolisher cannons or plasma cannons on your tank commanders will also be benefiting from this, meaning occasionally you can sneak through some unwanted big damage attacks through high defensive profiles. Now, one of the reasons I think this is a pretty interesting ability to include onto Astra Militarum specifically is that they don't have a ton of rerolls within the faction. Where these Gene-Rot Might effects become absolutely silly is when you have an effect like full rerolls to hit. This is a combination used pretty often in Tau Empire, for example, where you can apply rerolls to hit from an effect like Shadow Sun, then apply an auto wounding on 6's ability like the Through Boldness Victory Warlord trait. With those rerolls, you have a greater chance of rolling 6's that then automatically wound, and if you really need to, you can even fish for 6's to automatically wound by rerolling all of your non-6 hit rolls. Astra Militarum don't have many effects like that, meaning that they can't combo off this effect quite as impressively as other factions can, but it applying to all of your Astra Militarum units means that the volume of attacks that are going to be affected is going to be pretty insane. Gone are the days of mass las guns pitter-pattering off of your armor. Now they're actually going to be a pretty significant threat, especially to low or medium armor targets. Now, we see some changes that were already in previous Dataslate documents, but the other change here is a change to the points cost for Imperial Guard infantry squads. While this might look the same as the existing points value for those infantry squads, we do see a nice little designer's note here that they have removed all of the entries for war gear options for those infantry, meaning that while the infantry squads themselves are still going to cost you 60 points, they're now going to come equipped with potentially free heavy weapons, free special weapons for sure, potentially a plasma pistol and melee weapon on your squad sergeants. Voxcasters also become free. There are a ton of ancillary special upgrades to the standard infantry squad unit that now cost 0 points. And since you're probably taking infantry squads into your Imperial Guard unit armies already, just to bulk out the number of objective secured troops options that you have and can double move around the table, these guys are going to be that much more effective. Keep in mind that not only Keep in mind, like we talked about before, that all of those weapons are going to be benefiting from Hammer of the Emperor. So even if you're taking plasma guns and plasma pistols, for example, those are also going to be getting those auto wounds on hit rolls of 6. Now, moving on to Adeptus Custodes. This is where we see the nerf hammer start to descend on these powerful armies in Warhammer 40,000. First off, we have a change here. The detachment abilities of Adeptus Custodes armies are changing so that only troops units in Adeptus Custodes detachments gain the objective secured ability. So these are specifically Prosecutor squads and Custodian Guard squads. That's it. All of their individual characters, Alaris Terminators, all of those foot custodians that used to be so good at taking objectives away from your opponent now no longer have objective secured innately. There were a lot of situations where Adeptus Custodes armies only had to clear out your opponent's objective secured, and if they had no ability to get it back, then a single character like a Shield Captain or Trajan, which can be very difficult to kill in their own right, especially alongside the previous version of the Bodyguard ability, would be taking those objectives away even from massed enemy units. That's no longer the case. Now, if the Adeptus Custodes troops units get removed, they also lose their access to objective secured. We also see some stratagems being restricted to once per game, these being Esteemed Amalgam, Emperor's Auspice, and Martial Discretion. Esteemed Amalgam being the Emperor's chosen stratagem that allows a unit to switch into the subfaction of a different shield host. That would allow some pretty insane combinations, like using the Shadowkeeper's shield host to reroll wound rolls against particularly hard to kill characters, or being able to switch into Solar Watch to fall back and charge, especially with Virtus Praetors, which already had access to a fallback and shoot ability, meaning that for 2 CP they could fall back and operate normally. While that wasn't used too often over the course of the game, it being restricted to only once per game certainly helps curb the flexibility of Emperor's chosen list, and hopefully we start to see some of the other shield hosts being brought to the fore. Martial Discretion is the stratagem that allows a unit to move into a different kata. Again, this is one that you didn't use too often during games, but I usually saw it used once or twice, especially if you are attacking a monster or vehicle unit to switch yourself into Rendax, or if you needed to perform actions on the move. And now it being restricted means, again, that flexibility is going to be reduced a little bit. The most important one out of these, in my opinion, is going to be this change to Emperor's Auspice. Emperor's Auspice turned off rerolls targeting a Adeptus Custodes unit. While it wasn't effective in 100% of matchups, in some situations really removed opponents' abilities to interact with Adeptus Custodes units. A lot of times, armies would rely on rerolls to get around high toughness values and especially transhuman effects like Arcane Genetic Alchemy. Now, making that a once per game ability means that any offensive rerolling abilities, and especially stratagems that reroll offensively, are going to be significantly more effective against these Adeptus Custodes armies. Last but certainly not least, we have another change to Emperor's Auspice and a change to the Arcane Genetic Alchemy that we just discussed. Those are both being changed to target only Adeptus Custodes infantry units. This curbs a little bit of the power of Virtus Praetors, which are one of the most commonly seen units in the Adeptus Custodes stable. Now that those stratagems cannot be used on them, and Emperor's Auspice can only be used once on the infantry units in the army, these frontline Adeptus Custodes units are going to be dropping a lot more quickly. Now, with all that in mind, it should be noted that Adeptus Custodes did not lose their faction ability to count as multiple models when controlling objectives, so while they are no longer objective secured, they are still oftentimes going to outnumber their opponents on objectives if they're able to kill enough of them. Adeptus Custodes players have been pretty used to playing like that because Virtus Praetors never benefited from that objective secured being biker units. So for some builds of Adeptus Custodes, that isn't the most transformative change in the world. Adeptus Mechanicus have mostly just had the changes from the Adeptus Mechanicus errata added to the Dataslate. I guess to have one central place to compile all these Dataslate changes, it is a little confusing, to be fair, having these rules printed in multiple places, especially since some of them are slightly different wording. For example, the clandestine infiltration stratagem says you can only use the stratagem twice, but in the Adeptus Mechanicus errata itself, it specifies you can only use it twice when playing a Strike Force or Onslaught game, otherwise it is restricted to once per game. Hopefully we see those changes represented in the Adeptus Mechanicus errata, otherwise we're going to open some questions, especially for smaller games, but it is what it is. Now, moving down to the last page, this one's a little bit of a roller coaster because we have a lot of already represented changes. Chaos Space Marine's Death of the False Emperor's change from the last Dataslate update being included here, alongside the Drukhari changes, but we have importantly a new Deathguard ability. Deathguard now apply objective secured to their Death Shroud and Blight Lord Terminators. Whoa! This is a big one. It means that these guys are going to operate a lot like Deathwing moving into the future. It's important to remember that Deathguard have the Heretic Astartes keyword, meaning that they are going to be impacted by the AP reduction. So while Deathguard did kind of drop off a cliff in terms of win rate recently, I do think that having objectives secured with their monumentally enhanced resistance from that AP reduction is going to give the faction a lot more interesting builds. Also, the thought of trying to kill a Playburst Crawler that's reducing my AP value by 1 makes me kind of want to die, so that's not awesome. We also have the Drukhari changes, as well as the Necron and Orcs changes that we've seen in previous copies of this data slate. We don't really need to talk about those now, but what we will do is talk about the changes to the other top factions in the game, Harlequins and Tau Empire. As I said before, we should also keep in note, especially for the Harlequins changes, that the Craftworld Eldar Errata did change a lot of how the faction worked, especially on the Craftworld side. And in addition with those Craftworld changes, the indirect fire change is going to inordinately impact Craftworlds. Covering the Harlequins specifically, the Mirror Architect pivotal role has been changed from everything within 6 inches are considered to be 6 additional inches away from attacking models, shooting them with ranged attacks, to, in your command phase, select 1 friendly Sadith core unit within 9, and until the start of your next command phase, each time an enemy unit is selected to shoot, that unit is considered to be an additional 6 inches away from the shooting model. This changes this pivotal role ability from being an essential auto-include in a Harlequin's army, making all of your opponent's attacks targeting almost your entire army within 6 inches of the Shadow Seer that has this pivotal role much more difficult to measure, but given that it's now restricted to core units, can only be used on a single unit that has to be selected, your opponent can probably target other stuff that isn't being affected by Mirror Architect if they need the extra distance. So outside of potentially large units of Sky Weavers seeing the table and being targeted by this ability, I don't really see too many use cases for it, especially given that Star Weavers and Void Weavers, the most common mainstays in Harlequin's armies, are not core keyworded. Those are now not going to be affected at all by this ability. We will probably see a change with the points updates that are also included in this data slate update to maybe more foot-based Harlequin armies, and maybe there's a place for this pivotal role in those styles of armies, but given the fact that it is no longer an aura, I have a tough time imagining that. The favor of Chegarak Warlord trait has been changed from applying to any attack roll, those being hit rolls, wound rolls, or saving throws, and allowing you to switch them to unmodified rolls of 6s, now only affects melee attacks. This is to curb a combo used alongside the Death Jester to allow the Death Jester to rotate one of its dice to a 6 to then trigger its exploding abilities on its special Shuriken Cannon, especially alongside Luck of the Laughing God and potentially Blade Storm that allowed a single Death Jester to deal an immense number of attacks if it was fishing for rolls of 6 and had that favor of Chegarak in the pocket to flip one of their dice to a 6 regardless. That would potentially Tesla those attacks and allow that guy to hit a character even through Lookouts or up to 9 times, which was, to be honest, a little bit silly. We also have some changes made to Star Weavers and Void Weavers. Star Weavers moving from 80 points up to 95, an increase of 15 points per model, and Void Weavers going up a monumental 40 points. I think I would have liked to have seen Void Weavers have an increased cost for their Prismatic Cannon and maybe slightly less of an increase for their Haywire Cannon, but even though we're making a little bit of a ham-fisted change here to those Void Weavers, I don't think it's unwarranted. Ever since the release of the Codex, especially since both of these units benefit from Luck of the Laughing God, without any changes to it, these units are going to be ridiculously difficult to kill and deal pretty significant damage from a very long range. Some of the synergy in the army, especially that Mirror Architect no longer affecting them, is a pretty big change for them, but I still think that the unit is going to survive for the most part. Maybe not in a 3 of in each list, maybe you'll only take 2 or 3, but I think that is a fine place for a unit to be standing. The Star Weaver change is probably more transformative, but it's certainly going to make Harlequin players rethink taking masses of Star Weavers and nothing else. Now, last but certainly not least, in this data slate change, we have the Tau Empire. First off, we have a change to the Mont-Ka tactical philosophy. It now only allows you to reroll rolls of 1 while within Mont-Ka range. That's starting at 18 inches and moving down to 12 and 9 as the game moves on. This used to improve your armor penetration characteristic, but now no longer does that full stop. In addition to the AP reduction that we're going to be seeing on a lot of armies moving forward, and the fact that saving throws are improved against indirect fire weapons, this makes high volume, low impact indirect fire weapons like airbursting fragmentation action projectors and smart missile systems much less effective, since those units will no longer be getting their +1 AP, also benefiting your opponent +1 save and potentially suffering -1 AP themselves. Devastating Counterstrike, the Farsight Enclave's tenant, has been changed to giving a free Marker Light token within 12 inches down to 9 inches. This means that a unit coming out of Deep Strike in Farsight Enclaves will not receive the benefit of that Marker Light token, and you're going to have to be taking some more Marker Lights in your Farsight Enclaves list outside of just relying on their sub-faction ability to give you them. To be honest, I think a more transformative and probably more balanced change to Farsight Enclaves would have been to change the Homing Beacon rule on Stealth Suit teams. That's the ability that allows Stealth Suits to call in Crisis Suit units on the top of turn 1 and allow them to use the Drop Zone Clear stratagem to get full rerolls, which is really what applies absolutely ridiculous alpha strikes to enemy armies. Losing out on that Marker Light token and potentially losing out on 1 point of AP are definitely impactful changes for Farsight Enclave's list, but definitely not as hard as they could have gone, and I don't think really targets what is most powerful about that particular subfaction. Given the other changes out of this data slate, I do think Farsight Enclaves probably still moves to being the most powerful Tau archetype. As we see in this next change, Broadside Battlesuits have lost the core keyword. This means that Broadside Battlesuits lose access to a ton of synergies, especially abilities like rerolls from Exemplar of the Montka and Shadow Sun's reroll ability. And in addition to being impacted by the indirect fire changes for their smart missile systems, those Broadside Battlesuits are going to be that much less effective. Not sad to see you go, Broadsides. That unit sucks. That sucks to play against. We also have a little bit of a change to Repulsor Impact Field and Photon Grenades. These both allowed you to impose charge penalties on incoming units and now have been clarified to not stack with each other. You can no longer effectively Tanglefoot your opponent for a big number by stacking multiple stratagems if they targeted both a Battlesuit and a Fire Warrior unit. In my opinion, I think the changes to Indirect Fire and the changes to the Broadside Battlesuits themselves are going to be the most impactful changes for the Tau Empire in this data slate update. The overall reduction in AP values that the army is going to be getting from Montka is a pretty big deal, and obviously the Farsight Enclaves change is pretty big as well. But to be honest, I would rather have them changed that Homing Beacon ability rather than the Farsight Enclaves tenant. But anyway, that is the entirety of the data slate update. And with that, that's going to be it today. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, everyone. Let me know down in the comments what you think about these changes, if you're going to be going back to some of these lesser played armies, and if this reinvigorates your excitement for Warhammer 40,000. It's almost a brand new game now. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. Also, the people who support the channel with a channel membership that you can join in the link down below the description. Get you some cool emojis, early access to videos, stuff like that. It's pretty sweet. And Twitch subscribers. All you people are awesome, and I love you. And remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.